Yeah, sure, of course it is. I think a museum is all about stories, and the core task of a museum is storytelling and making sure the story it tells reaches as large an audience as possible. So in a way, everything a museum does is storytelling, and maybe not in the classical sense of, standing up on a soapbox and getting a crowd of people around you and starting a story like, once upon a time there was this beautiful painter, but storytelling in many different ways. Storytelling through the objects that they show, storytelling in the exhibitions that they perform, but also storytelling in the menus that are in the restaurant and in the items that are in the shop, and in the way that the staff and the employees of the museum approach visitors. Everything a museum does is storytelling. Well, art, some people say that art should stand on its own, and I think, for some artworks that is true. But if you think about most of the artworks, especially historical artworks, you need some context and you need some additional understanding for it to become meaningful to you. So yes, definitely art museums also need storytelling. And you could say that, for instance, the Mona Lisa or the Night Watch or any of these other world famous paintings, they don't need storytelling. There's enough of a story in the paintings themselves, and that's true. But the story of these paintings has already started long before people actually came to see them, and will continue long after people continue to see them through movies, through items on television, through the Wikipedia pages about these paintings. So even art, even contemporary art, requires some sort of storytelling. And indeed, sometimes, the aesthetics, just a beautiful experience, can be enough of a story. But for most art, most of the time, only the beautiful experience is not enough to actually make people want to listen. Most people want to listen and care about the object. So yeah, cinema is all about storytelling, but so is the theater, so are libraries, literature, music is all about storytelling. A lot of what we do is storytelling. I think basically 99% of what humans do is storytelling, and 1% of what we do is being lost or something like that. Some people will have a different ratio of that. But yeah, museums can learn a lot from Hollywood. They can learn a lot from Bollywood and all the other major producers of cinema. They can learn a lot from independent cinema from countries, including, I'm sure Poland has a beautiful independent cinema scene. So, are they the same? Yes, in the terms that they tell stories. But are they the same in how they tell the stories? And the answer is no. So a typical movie lasts somewhere between an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. It requires you to sit still in the cinema, watch, listen, and then maybe afterwards, when you go for a drink with your friends, talk about it a little bit. But if you're at home, afterwards you go to bed, you sleep on it, and that's it. A museum is a very different kind of medium, right? Typically, when you visit with friends or with your family, and if you visit alone, there are other people around you. You explore that story at your own speed, at your own, in your own way. You can take a shortcut. You can, wait somewhere for 15 minutes if it's interesting to you. So even though it's both storytelling and both cinema and museums will use a lot of the same techniques, the way it works out in a museum is completely different. And I think a museum can embrace that. They can embrace the fact that they're in a physical building with physical objects and other visitors. Whereas in a cinema, you're in the dark with popcorn around you. And that's a big difference. And museums can embrace that difference and make use of it in their storytelling. So every story exists within a community. There's no story that's just out there laying around waiting for people to pick it up. A story always exists in a tradition. I tell it and you listen, and then you tell it to your children, or you write it down, and the book starts to live its own life, and other people are inspired by it. And this tradition of storytelling always involves community. So if you're telling a story in a museum, And if you're just, placing the object there and you put a label, but you don't recognize that this object or this painting or this artifact is part of the collective memory and the experience of groups of people, you're neglecting a large part of that object's histories. And you see this happening a lot with historical objects, right? So, for instance, you can take an object from a Native American tribe, a First Nations tribe, and take it out of the context, out of the living memory, and put it in a museum. And then it's like, mask used in birth ceremonies. And the audience is like, But they don't really understand it. It's not a story anymore. It's just an object that looks maybe pretty. But if you take that object and you bring it back to the community and you ask them to tell the stories and use it in the ceremonies and elaborate on it, and you then ask people to observe that, or you make a video or you capture that in a different way, people will have a much deeper understanding of actually the story that this object tells. So every story is always part of a community. There's no story that exists in vacuum, and you have to understand that if you want to tell stories as a museum or as anyone else who tells stories. Sure, like interaction and participation when we're talking about storytelling are two very different things, although they're typically used as synonyms for each other by most people. Synonyms, sorry, I struggled a bit with the word there. So the way I see the difference is interactivity is pressing a button, right? It's, you ask people to engage, but you don't really care about the outcome. So it can be like asking at the start of a lecture, who has also been to France? And then people raise their hands and you say, okay, 5 people, and you move on and nothing changes. Participation is not like interactivity. Interactivity is a trick. It's a technology. It's a little thing you do. Participation is a culture. It's a belief in that when all stories are part of communities, every person in this community also has something to add to the story. So participation is asking at the start of a story, who's been to France? And when people raise their hands, you ask them, and what do you take away from France? And did you drink great wines there? Or did you see the beautiful architecture of Paris? And you build on that story and you use their experiences to actually tell a story that is much more inclusive than a story that just has some elements of interactivity. So you're asking for the main trends. Well, there are so many trends that trends themselves have become a trend. You can buy a subscription on many websites, and for 500 euros a year or so, you get new trends every year. Trends are a big trend. But if in my work, what I focus on are 3 things. The first one is connectivity. More than ever before, people in the world are connected with each other. So they're no longer only connected with their family or the village they live in, but they're connected with anyone around the world, which means that if for any idea, for any topic that you care about, you can find a group of people that cares about it as well. I grew up in a small village. If you had a strange interest in that village, you were alone. But right now, if you grow up in a small village, you can use the internet to share this interest with people all over the world. So that's the first trend. The second trend is that this globalization of the world has allowed these ideas to move everywhere and become relevant everywhere. So whereas before things, certain topics or certain stories, for instance, a historical story about Poland would be relevant in Poland, but not in many other places. Right now there's Polish communities living in Amsterdam, in all over the world. And their stories, their ideas, they become relevant in completely different contexts. And they start to interact with other people's ideas right there. And the third trend, which is very much connected to these two, is this sense of the digital era, of digital empowerment of people. I'd like to call it DIY society, do-it-yourself society, which means that these connected people that travel around the world and take their ideas with them, they're no longer passively waiting for somebody to tell them what to do. If they see something that they want to do, and if they see something that is broken, they're going to organize themselves and fix it. And together these trends create a certain a world wherein at any given moment, in any given place, people are working on new ideas, working on new stories, working on new collaborations, maybe with physical people around them, maybe connected digitally with people halfway across the world. If you're sitting in a train and somebody next to you is on the phone, this person may be playing a game, this person may be watching Netflix, but at the same time this person may be organizing a revolution on the other side of the world, or maybe contributing to an arts restoration project in another country. And I think that's just fascinating and gives us a lot of opportunities to tell stories and engage people in new ways. So based on my experience working with many organizations for over a decade and solving a lot of their questions, so questions they have about how to engage communities, how to make the digital world work for them, and all these questions. A couple of years ago, I got together with Jim Richardson, who's a friend and the organizer of Museum Next, and we looked at each other and we said, we need to develop some sort of framework that can help people to answer all these questions that they ask us themselves. And the result of this work was a digital engagement framework. And the way we approached this was also very much a community effort. So the first version, I remember I drew on the back of a coaster, like all great ideas. But we then took this coaster into workshops and we got the feedback from people and we developed it and we evolved. And in the years since, we've had a couple of versions. And in total, it's been used or downloaded at least by over 50,000 people. And it's in use by thousands of organizations around the world, all of whom give us feedback and new ideas on how to actually use this framework. And I'm very happy of that because it was a community effort and it's now being used by the community and it's living a life of its own. The digital engagement framework in some ways is definitely an example of how you can connect ideas with people and people with ideas, even though it's also, that question is also the subject of the framework itself. I think the collaboration of thousands of people on creating this framework and the tens of thousands of people who've used it and tweeted about it and shared photos with us of how they used it. All of that combined is definitely a way of connecting ideas with people. So after the digital engagement framework, it answers a very narrow question, right? How can cultural organizations and others use the digital media and the opportunities of the digital era to better connect with communities? And that's, even though it's a big question, it's rather narrow in focus, and our work and our practice has expanded well beyond that. So a couple of years ago, again, I was thinking like, we need to make some sort of tool to help cultural professionals who are walking around with questions, answer these questions themselves. So I got together with my business partner, Eric Skilp, and we developed a cards set, Cards for Culture. It's 100 cards, and it's a cultural strategy consultant in a box. And you can use it to answer basically any question you have about your own organization and to develop and explore the answers yourself. Again, it's developed with a lot of people, in collaboration with a lot of people, and it's now in use in hundreds of organizations around the world who are also emailing me all the ways they use it, and it's incredibly inspirational to see how an idea and some cards go around the world and help organizations innovate. It's a community-based tool. It builds on the knowledge that's within organizations and that people have themselves, and it gives them a way to ask the questions that matter, to find creative answers, to develop new solutions, to respond to trends, and all these other important things that we have to do on a day-to-day basis.